So was Muhammad, peas and dressing be upon him, a feminist? And this is an article by Jim Garrison, okay, the president and founder of Ubiquity University, whatever the hell that is. Call me cynical, but this seems like a total clickbait title, but hey, who doesn't want clicks? Now, I'll say up front that I think, in a way, this guy's intentions are good. I think he's trying to get Muslim men in countries where women are being oppressed to treat women better. I think we can all get on board with that, unless you're some kind of evil prick lacking all empathy. And I think he's trying to accomplish that by holding up Muhammad as some shining feminist role model. The obvious problem being that even if here and there Muhammad did have some relatively enlightened or progressive views concerning women, that doesn't cancel out all the backward stuff in the Quran and the Hadith regarding the treatment of women, such as the detailed rules regarding what you're allowed to do to or with your female slaves. As I said on the show before, in Islam, there was this concept of manumission, the liberating of a slave, which was considered one of the most virtuous acts one could perform. I think it was actually seen as a means for atoning for sin. Despite this, it still seems like there were a lot of people hanging on to their slaves, and there was quite a booming slave trade in the Arab world for quite some time. And as I said, it's not like everyone was just setting their slaves free willy-nilly. The Quran has detailed prescriptions regarding the keeping and treatment of slaves, including how female slaves could and couldn't be used sexually. Actually, I'll read a couple of verses. This first one doesn't deal with slavery specifically. This one is more about the treatment of women in general, the husband-wife dynamic, I think. But here we go. Men have authority over women by right of what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient regarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. And I believe that's actually talking about guarding their loins, meaning remaining sexually faithful or whatever. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. If you fear a breach between them, then appoint an arbiter from his folks and an arbiter from her folks. If they desire reconciliation, God will effect between them. Indeed, God is all-knowing, all-aware. Al-Quran and Nisa, verses 34 through 35. Then this next one is from, I think it's Sahih al-Bukhari, which is from a collection of hadith, I believe, that the Prophet married her, and this is in regard to Aisha, the Prophet's notoriously young wife, I think was it his third wife, that the Prophet married her when she was 6 years old, and he consummated his marriage when she was 9 years old, and then she remained with him for 9 years, till his passing, or passing away, rather. And Aisha's age, I think, is still a matter of contention. I think there's apologists who try to say she was at least well into her teens. And I think there's people, Islamic scholars, who try to say that she was probably older, but for political reasons after the fact, her age was recorded as being younger. At least I think I remember hearing that. Or maybe since it was a political marriage, like most marriages were throughout history, I think. It was about dowries and alliances, etc. Maybe some try to suggest that he married her young, but nothing was consummated till well later. But generally speaking, the consensus, even among many Muslims, seems to be, around 6 years old is when he married her, and the marriage was consummated around 9 or 10. So pretty revolting by our modern standards, and I imagine even by the standards of many ancient cultures, it was probably eyebrow raising, to say the least. I think there's a lot of cultures where people married very young, probably in their early teens or whatever. And this probably had something to do with high mortality rates, the fact that the average lifespan was shockingly low in comparison to modern standards, and the modern development of the average person being able to live to a relatively ripe old age. I mean, this is, well, relatively modern. I'm looking at an online chart here. Life expectancy at birth in years. For the Paleolithic, it was 33. Bronze Age, 26. Classical Greece, 28. Let's see, Classical Rome, 20 to 30 years. If a child survived to age 10, life expectancy was an additional 37.5 years. So a total average life expectancy of 47.5 years. And for some reason, it looks like the medieval caliphate did pretty good. Average life expectancy from birth of 35 plus years. Average lifespan of Islamic scholars was 59 to 84 and 69 to 75 in Islamic Spain. So say what you want about Islam, but they did have that golden period in the Middle Ages. How much of that was built on slavery, conquest, etc., I don't know. I'm not an Islamic scholar. Let's see. Late medieval England, average life expectancy from birth only 30 years old. If you made it to 21, life expectancy was an additional 43 years, so a total average of 64, not bad. Early modern England, only 33 to 40. 1900, the world average life expectancy from birth was only 31 years old. 1950, world average 48. 2010, world average 67.2. But to get back to what I was saying, I think even in the ancient world, in many cultures, the idea of men marrying pre-teens would have been considered rather unseemly, to say the least. And I'm just looking, apparently in ancient Rome, the average age of marriage, or when a girl was seen as being ready for marriage, was roughly around 12 or 14, which is still shocking by our modern standards, but I guess somewhat better than what we see with Muhammad and Aisha. Let's see, I'm looking at what the standard was in ancient Greece. Many women were married by the age of 14 or 16, while men commonly married around the age of 30. Wow. Quite a disparity. See, I'm looking at what the standard was in the ancient Jewish world. Minimum age for marriage under Jewish law was 13 for boys, 12 for girls. I think I remember when I was growing up hearing on documentaries and so forth, scholars kind of estimating that Mary, if she was indeed a real person, that she probably would have been around 13 or 14 when she married. I'm, of course, referring to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So you can see, looking at other standards in the ancient world, where usually it's as shocking as 12 sounds. It's usually in between like 12 and 14. Aisha's marriage consummated around 9, supposedly, according to the popular account. So, yeah, just disturbing. And this one I got from, I remember a long time ago, it was a couple of years back, maybe, I did a story on a pamphlet which ISIS had released regarding the treatment of slaves. And at least some of their prescriptions or regulations were taken directly from the Quran and perhaps other official or respected Islamic textual sources, such as the Hadith as well. But here's one that's taken directly from the Quran, and this is right from ISIS's pamphlet. Question 4. Is it permissible to have intercourse with a female captive? It is permissible to have sexual intercourse with the female captive. Allah the Almighty said, "Successful are the believers who guard their chastity, except from their wives, or the captives and slaves that their right hands possess, for then they are free from blame." Quran looks like Surah 23, verses or ayats 5 through 6. So you can see, you can try to paint a pretty picture of Muhammad. And like I said, it might be a mixed bag. I think he actually did have some progressive ideas regarding the treatment of women, but at the same time, still allowed slavery, or if not him himself, his holy book, which was supposedly recited to him by the angel Gabriel, yes, sarcasm intended, allows for the sexual use of female slaves, etc. So this cat, Jim Garrison, or whatever his name is, okay, seems to really be trying to sugarcoat Muhammad. Sugar-coated Muhammad. But I think I'm going to read a little bit from the article, and I'll do my best to try to remain objective and take a column like I see him approach as I take on this guy's arguments and talking points. Okay, yeah, so I was right. The guy's name is Jim Garrison, and don't worry, I won't do another South Park joke. So here we go. The Prophet Muhammad would be appalled by how current Islamic fundamentalists are treating women under their control. This suppression is done in the name of Islamic law known as Sharia, but the current suppression of women is shaped by, and here, only I think 2 or 3 sentences in, we already got a typo. But the current suppression of women is shaped by cultural and history. I think he means culture and history. I screw up a lot, so I'm not going to be too hard on him for that one, but I have to admit I do feel a little bit of schadenfreude. It has little basis in the Quran, and it is certainly not consistent with anything we know about what Muhammad taught or how he treated women. So already I think that's intellectually dishonest. He says it has little basis in the Quran, and it is certainly not consistent with anything we know about what Muhammad taught or how he treated women. So as I just mentioned, the Quran itself mentions the sexual use of female captives or slaves. So, and I think there's a lot of vile things about the way women are treated in certain Muslim cultures, from having acid thrown in their faces, being stoned, honor killings, etc. But we know that terrorist groups like Boko Haram and the Islamic State both engage in the keeping of sex slaves. And as I just pointed out, straight from the Quran. And also the Quran speaks about how if your wife gets a little out of line, maybe you try to be nice at first, but if that doesn't work, strike her. So already intellectually dishonest. Out of all the founders of the great religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Islam, and Judaism, Muhammad was easily the most radical and empowering in his treatment of women. Arguably, he was history's first feminist. And if I can digress for a moment, hey, it's my podcast, why not? Here's an article from 2015 from The Guardian in the science, specifically anthropology section. I didn't know The Guardian had an anthropology section. Early men and women were equal, say scientists. Our prehistoric forebears are often portrayed as spear-wielding savages, but the earliest human societies are likely to have been founded on enlightened egalitarian principles, according to scientists. A study has shown that in contemporary hunter-gatherer tribes, men and women tend to have equal influence on where their group lives and who they live with. The findings challenge the idea that sexual equality is a recent invention, suggesting that has been the norm for humans for most of our evolutionary history. Mark Dibble, an anthropologist who led the study at University College London, said, "There is still this wider perception that hunter-gatherers are more macho or male-dominated. We'd argue that was only with the emergence of agriculture, when people could start to accumulate resources, that inequality emerged." Dibble says the latest findings suggest that equality between the sexes may have been a survival advantage and played an important role in shaping human society and evolution. Sexual equality is one of an important suite of changes to social organization, including things like pair bonding, our big social brains, and language. That distinguishes humans, he said. It's an important one that hasn't really been highlighted before. So according to at least this one study being mentioned here, equal treatment of women can literally be traced back, possibly, arguably, to prehistory, a long-ass time before the advent of Islam. And that's kind of in keeping what I've heard about ancient, pre-agricultural revolution, matriarchal societies, etc. And that kind of reminds me of the societal structure of bonobos, too. And bonobos are those more peaceful, kind of sex-obsessed, nothing wrong with that, relatives, diminutive relatives, they're smaller in stature, of chimpanzees, and thusly close relatives of ourselves as well. I mean, there had to have been people before Muhammad who suggested some kind of egalitarian attitude. I don't know if this guy's just pulling this out of his you-know-where because he wants to paint Muhammad in this positive light or what. And actually, if we jump up from prehistory to ancient Egypt, here's a paper from Cornell Library at library.cornell.edu. The Status of Women in Egyptian Society. An exception to most other ancient societies, Egyptian women achieved parity with Egyptian men. They enjoyed the same legal and economic rights, at least in theory, and this concept can be found in Egyptian art and contemporary manuscripts. The disparities between people's legal rights were based on differences in social class and not on gender. Legal and economic rights were afforded to both men and women. And it goes on, it is interesting that when the Greeks conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, Egyptian women were allowed more rights and privileges than Greek women who were forced to live under the less equal Greek system. So, I mean, prehistory and ancient Egypt, there's at least two examples predating Muhammad of parity between the genders or sexes. I'll continue with the article. Just a little reminder, because I digress to reiterate, he ends by talking about Muhammad was easily the most radical and empowering in his treatment of women. History's first feminist. This is of critical importance because if there is one single thing that Arabs and Muslims could do to reform and revitalize their crisis-ridden cultures, it would be to liberate their women and provide them with the full rights women are enjoying in more and more countries around the world. Women's equality is key to a real Arab Spring. And I can't really argue with that paragraph, at least. And he's not the first to say that. Other people have said if you really want to change these kind of backwards Islamic cultures where women are still being oppressed, etc., and this might be wishful thinking, but if you can, ideally, you'd want to find a way to empower the women in those oppressive societies. And you'd probably start to see some progress. But that, of course, is much easier said than done. How do you go about convincing the men in these oppressive cultures to not necessarily hand over the reins completely to women, but at least begin to allow women some degree of parity? I'm sure there's some good men in these cultures who would want to see the empowerment of women, but I'm sure there's many who don't and who enjoy the status quo, including probably many of the mullahs and leaders, etc. And this guy tries to say it's history and culture that leads to these oppressive attitudes towards women. And I've heard it argued a lot that there might be certain negative traditions or practices that we think of as Islamic that may be cultural, that may be pre-Islamic technically, but come on, you can't give Islam a free pass. Is it really pure coincidence that we see in many Islamic cultures the oppression of women, and we can find verses similar to those that I read earlier in Islamic holy books, including the Quran? My guess is, come on, man, it's a little more than coincidence. Religion plays at least a part in all this. But I'll continue. Among the founders of the great religions, Confucius barely mentioned women at all and assumed in all his teachings that they were subordinate to men within a patriarchal order. Buddha taught that women could become enlightened but had to be pressured 3 times before allowing women to become nuns, and then only on the condition, as he put it, that the highest nun would be lower than the lowest monk. In the Gospel accounts, Jesus did not explicitly comment on the status of women, although he did associate with women of ill repute and with non-Jewish women. Moses was thoroughly patriarchal, and there is virtually nothing in the Torah that indicates specific concern about women's rights. So I won't argue with him about Moses or the Gospels. And even though I'm an atheist, I've had a long-standing fascination or interest with Eastern religion and philosophy. But despite that, I don't know as much about Confucianism as I would like. But I did study Buddhism quite a bit. And like I said, despite being an atheist, to this day, I think I incorporate a lot of the key tenets of Buddhism into my life, like trying to maintain a certain level of equanimity or detachment, not letting myself be ruled by my emotions, trying to have compassion for other living beings. But to be honest, I never really sat down and thought about the status of women in Buddhism. And it's probably because when I was reading books like the Dhammapada or the Diamond Sutra, I don't remember the status of women coming up that often. It's probably because the emphasis was always so heavily placed on enlightenment. But the idea that the highest nun might be considered lower than the lowest monk, that doesn't honestly surprise me that much because I think, unfortunately, sadly, in many ancient cultures, probably many modern cultures around the world too, unfortunately, women have been looked at as being inferior to men. And it wouldn't surprise me that even in an enlightened system like Buddhism, we would still find some vestiges of that. But I think the fact that the Buddha, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, thought that women could become enlightened, I think to me that says a lot because enlightenment is the ultimate goal. That is it. To free oneself from samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death. At least that's how it goes within Buddhist belief. But continues, Muhammad was fundamentally different. He both explicitly taught the radical equality of women and men as a fundamental tenet of true spirituality, and he took numerous concrete measures to profoundly improve the status and role of women in Arabia during his own lifetime. Muhammad was sensitized to the plight of women because he was born poor and orphaned at a very early age. He was also illiterate. He knew, as few did, what poverty and social exclusion meant. Confucius was born into the gentry scholar class of ancient China. Buddha was born a wealthy prince in Nepal. Jesus was born the son of a carpenter with royal lineage and within a tightly knit Jewish community in Palestine. Moses was born into a Hebrew family and raised in the palace of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Muhammad had none of these advantages. So I've noticed my bullshit detector went off a bit here too. You could argue that if Moses, I mean, there's so many reasons to dispute the historicity of the Exodus narrative. But let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say Moses was real and that he actually grew up in the palace of an Egyptian pharaoh. As I was just mentioning, there was relative parity between men and women in ancient Egypt, in that differences were based more on class than gender. So you can make the argument that Moses would have learned something about equality while he's in Egypt, perhaps, at least equality of the sexes. And he talks about Jesus was born the son of a carpenter with royal lineage. So I think the royal lineage bit is a stretch. This guy, man, he is hungry. He really wants to make Muhammad stand out from these other guys. I think the claim of Jesus having royal lineage is probably a literary device utilized by the gospel writers to kind of legitimize or reinforce the idea that Jesus is worthy of being the Messiah. And let's say you could trace Jesus's roots, and I think the Bible does, the Gospels do include a couple of different versions of the genealogy of Jesus. Let's say you could trace Jesus' genealogy all the way back to David, and let's not get into the historicity of David. Well, maybe let's get into it a little. I think I read that there was a historical king of Damascus that claimed victory over an enemy king or kings, and I think it's pronounced Stele, Stele, usually like a stone with an engraving in it, that may make mention of the House of David. So I think David might have been a historical figure, maybe not. I'm willing to concede that he may very well have been. But even if we could trace Jesus' lineage back to David, that doesn't change the fact that Jesus, if he's historically existed, is basically described in the Gospels as a humble carpenter. Or I believe the Greek word is tekton, and depending on the time of its use, could mean a woodworker or a stoneworker. So even if he did arguably have royal blood, he was living probably like a peasant. I think like Dominic Crossan has talked about. We tend to think of carpenters in our modern age as being people who make a fairly good living. Well, even though I work for my family's carpentry business, the making a good living thing doesn't necessarily apply to me, but I'll try to resist the temptation to go on a digression. Um, but in the time of Jesus, a manual laborer, even a skilled carpenter, would have been pretty low on the social ladder. So trying to say that Jesus was kind of too hoity-toity to understand the plight of women because he had royal blood, I think that's quite a stretch. Sibel continued. During 7th century Arabia, female infanticide was commonplace. Muhammad abolished it. A saying in the Hadith, the collection of sayings of Muhammad, records that Muhammad said that the birth of a girl was a blessing. Women in Arabia at the time were essentially considered property and had absolutely no civil rights. Muhammad gave them the rights to own property, and they were extended very important marital and inheritance rights. And I think that is true. Muhammad did supposedly implement some rather progressive policies regarding the right of women to own property and inherit wealth. But once again, it goes back to my point, not to sound like a broken record. Yeah, he may have done some good things, but that doesn't erase all the stuff about slavery and concubinage and being able to use female slaves for sex or being able to strike your wife, etc. Prior to Muhammad, the dowry paid by a man for his bride was given to her father as part of the contract between two men. Women had no say in the matter. Muhammad declared that women needed to assent to the marriage and that the dowry should go to the bride, not the father. Furthermore, she could keep the dowry even after marriage. The wife did not have to use the dowry for family expenses. That was the responsibility of the man. Women were also given the right to divorce their husbands, something unprecedented at the time. In a divorce, the woman was empowered to take the dowry with her. So, I mean, yeah, once again, this is all good stuff. And I would even argue that if you could get men in the Muslim world to follow this more positive aspect of Muhammad's example, I would be all for it. I am all for it. But how do you untangle this good stuff from all the really bad negative stuff that we find in the Quran and the Hadith, which people use to subjugate and oppress women in the Muslim world? So I don't know. I mean, it seems a little intellectually dishonest to me. Why doesn't he bring up the negative role that religion plays in all this too? Maybe he thinks that others have already spoken enough about that. I mean, this guy obviously sounds like he's very sympathetic towards Islam. But I don't know. I just think it's intellectually honest to at least try to present a well-rounded and complete view, not just to conveniently excise the negative role religion plays in the oppression of women and sugarcoat Muhammad to high heaven.